Hello, my name is Gary, and I'm with POL 490. My group consists of Karina Chavez and Nadia Olivas, and today, with their efforts included, we're going to be going over the torture and public policy here within the United States. All right, so this is actually one of the most interesting case studies so far this semester, I believe. And to be able to understand what's going on, we first need to know what the Geneva Convention is. So it was established in 1864, and what it is it's the basis of how militaries interact with other human beings during armed conflicts. Before the Geneva Convention, if a military invaded another country, those that were caught within the war zone, so the civilians, those people that just happened to be living in the area, there was no regard for those human lives. The children, the women, the men, everybody was suffering and they were stuck in these kind of cataclysmic conditions. Then also the prisoners of war, they were tortured. They would be enslaved to, say, build railroads, or they'd be utilized for their manual labor, or they would just be tortured for information. So it was really bad for both sides, depending upon who you're. It doesn't matter who you were with. If you were caught before the Geneva Convention was in place by the number of countries that now have signed the treaty, you were in a world of hurt. And so that's why it came about, and it was spearheaded by the United States in 1864. Now, the United States pushes for human rights very, very hard, and there was no exception here with the Geneva Convention. And so, what makes this case so interesting is that in 2003, the United States was caught torturing the detainees at the Abu Ghraib prison. But to make matters worse, it was also found that the same occurrences were happening in Afghanistan and prisons out there, prisons in Iraq, and also prisons or the Guantanamo Bay prison. And so the problem was much more systemic than we were initially led to believe. Now, this picture that you see here is a photo from the Abu Ghraib uh, prison, and you can see that he's hooded. He's being forced to stand up, and it looks like there's some electrical wire or conduit attached to him. So it's so shocking that the United States was involved in this, and it being a systemic thing, it's obvious that it's not just the actions of a few rogue soldiers, but it's actually a systemic issue that one has to wonder, does it come from a policy decision? Did somebody from the higher up uh, say to every person running these prisons that this is how we're going to conduct ourselves? Well, we're also going to talk about the torture memos that were written by George W. Bush and just see how that contributed to the case. All right, so now that we've established a case summary for this, let's go over exactly what occurred at this prison. So in 2003, we had a number of photographs surface, and those photos depicted military soldiers performing these abusive and torturous acts on the prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison. Now, in this photo, you can see that this child is holding a photo of his dead father next to a military soldier giving a thumbs up. So if that doesn't strike you kind of to the core, then I don't know what will. Now, the Takuba report was the first of several reports that documents what was found. He said that he witnessed punching, slapping, kicking of detainees, jumping on their naked feet, videotaping and photographing of naked and female detainees. They arranged the male detainees and piled them up and jumped on them. A male MP guard had sex with a female detainee, and military working dogs were utilized to intimidate and frighten detainees. At least one biting and one severe injury took place from that. And I quote, he found that it was performed to, quote, set physical and mental conditions for favorable interrogation of witnesses. The next report was conducted by the ICRC, and the ICRC is established within the Geneva Convention as an independent agency that is allowed to go and visit prisoners and make sure that human rights are protected. Now, they went and visited not just the Abu Ghraib prison, but they also visited numerous other prisons in Iraq and Afghanistan. And their findings concluded that this wasn't just occurring at this specific prison, but it was also occurring all over the place throughout Iraq. And then the next report, Fay's report, this was Major General Fay, and he investigated the behavior of the 205th Military Intelligence Brigade. What he found was that there was slapping, kicking, restricting of breathing, dislocating of shoulders of a detainee, harsh treatment. Dogs were used to threaten and terrify detainees, and they were released into the cells with the juvenile detainees. And so, as you can see, these torturous practices are pretty extensive. And so, we're going to talk about next why these men and women participated in these practices. What is the justification for torture in the first place, and why would they have done it in their minds, and maybe even in the American policymakers' minds? All right, so the photo that I have here is another photo of a prisoner at the Abu Ghraib prison, and you can see that there's a military soldier on top of his back, and it appears that he is holding this person in an uncomfortable position and most likely asphyxiating him or restricting his breathing in some manner. And as you can see from the expression on his face, he looks pretty satisfied with what he's doing. Now, what would cause somebody to feel satisfaction in torture, and why would you justify it in the first place? That's the point of this slide, and we're going to talk about that. The ticking time bomb scenario is typically what people utilize to justify torture. And what it says is that there has to be a planned attack that the captive is aware of. Then, torture has to be the only way of getting that information, and the captive has to be willing to provide that information after the torture. The information then has to be accurate, and you have to have enough time at the very end of the whole process to be able to actually do anything about it. Now, in most situations, this is probably not going to work. And in the Abu Ghraib scenario, most specifically, many of the detainees were found to be non-members of Al-Qaeda. They weren't part of the insurgency. They were ordinary criminals. They were detained, and some of them were innocent and detained by mistake. And that makes it even worse. So this person that you're looking at in this photo may or may not have actually been guilty of anything. Now, if the ticking time bomb scenario doesn't work most of the time, why would we then engage in torture? Well, tactical intelligence is really what it comes down to. The theory is that if we can obtain tactical intelligence on the battlefield, then we can reduce the amount of American deaths or injuries that occur out there. Now, this could apply to any military. Any military could justify torture then in any case. And so that's why the Geneva Convention was created to protect detainees from torture. If Americans are captured in any other country, we don't want them tortured any more than any other country wants their captives tortured by us. And so it makes a lot of sense. There's a huge stake by every country to engage in this treaty and actually follow the ground rules that it sets. And so that is the basis of this slide. And we're going to go on and discuss what actually occurred here to start the torturous process and abuse that was found at the Abu Ghraib prison. All right, so we've talked about what kind of torture occurred. We've talked about why one would justify torture as a viable option. And now we're going to talk about why this was allowed to occur and it occurred for such an extended period of time. Now, it all starts with General S. Bybee, who is head of the Justice Department, and he says that he wants to exclude Al-Qaeda from the Geneva Convention because they're non-state actors. They're rogue, they don't represent any government, and they're not going to engage in the Geneva Convention any more than we should. Now, Alberto Gonzales, who is part of the counsel to the president, he seconds that. He says that this is a new war. We need to change our tactics in such a new type of atmosphere. And there's many who oppose these two, Colin Powell being one of them. He says that this is going to undo over 100 years of policy. And if caught engaging in such practices, it's going to really undermine the overall goal of the United States. Well, President Bush decided to side with the Justice Department. He signed a 50-page memo that has some pretty specific changes to the way that the Geneva Convention should be read. And it applied to Al Qaeda only. Now, I'm going to read a couple quotes here. First, it says um, that to constitute torture, it has to be an act that it inflicts pain and is equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. And then it really narrows in specifically on what you can even call torture. So first it says there has to be a specific intent to inflict severe pain. And so even if the defendant, the person who is actually doing this, knows that there's going to be severe pain or death from the actions, if the intent is not to kill or injure that person, if the intent rather is to extract information, well, then the act is justified. Uh, and furthermore, he also says that the person engaging in such tactics has the right to defend themselves, saying they were acting in self-defense, saying the nation is under attack, therefore I am under attack. And so it really changed the way that people were allowed to conduct themselves. People could get away with it, and it really narrowed what was allowed to be called torture in the first place. All right, so how do we move from a memo to what occurred at the Abu Ghraib prison? Well, it starts in Guantanamo Bay, and there we had many intelligence officers who were becoming very frustrated with what was occurring. They had detainees there for over a year, and they were unable to get any information out of them. So they were frustrated, and they sent off a request for new interrogation techniques, and what they received were 24 new ones that they could apply to these prisoners. And though they were direct violations of the Geneva Convention, it worked. They were allowed to apply it at Guantanamo Bay. What occurred next was General Miller, who was from the Guantanamo Bay prison, went off to visit the Abu Ghraib prison. And when he visited, they say that he wanted to Gitmoize the prison. Now, the reason that Guantanamo Bay was more allowed to get away with this, though, is because they had those members of Al Qaeda. Remember, in the memo, it said that that members of Al Qaeda were excluded from the Geneva Convention. The Abu Ghraib prison was different, though. The people that were there were Iraqi criminals, not part of the insurgency, and innocent people who were arrested by accident. And so the policy didn't really protect the people who were performing these acts. And as you can see in the photo, a lot of satisfaction by these soldiers who have been photographed. And this has been circulated all over the world now. And so these torturous practices that I've already defined started taking place at the Abu Ghraib prison. And there was a huge fallout once these photos surfaced. And I'll talk about what occurred after the photos surfaced here in the next slide. All right, so in conclusion, there's no evidence that President Bush directly ordered anybody to torture anyone. But what is obvious is that President Bush's memo had much more wide-reaching effects than he probably intended that they would. Quickly after the signing of his memo, there was a sequence of events that occurred. And let's just review those. So first, he decided that he wanted to exclude Al Qaeda from the Geneva Convention. Then the term of torture became narrowly defined. It became increasingly difficult to prosecute an American for torturing anyone that was related to Al Qaeda. Then Guantanamo Bay, who was disenfranchised by their results, submitted for more approved techniques for interrogation. They were approved. Then a Guantanamo Bay member went to Al Ghraib. He brought his influence. He told them to utilize military police to abuse and torture these detainees, much like the way Guantanamo Bay does, because it's been working for them. Then Al Ghuraib begins doing it, and countless others do as well. And it doesn't take any more than 6 months before photos get out and the United States is forever tarnished. And so I think the greater picture here, the entire intent of this case is for us to understand that as future policy actors, the policies that we implement are going to have much more wide-reaching effects than maybe we originally intend, much like George W. Bush did. And if we can take that away from this case, then reviewing it has been a great success. So that's all I have for this case study. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.